Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Dancing with Damage. I'm Ian, your resident philosopher.
I'm Abby, your resident author. And this is Archie, your resident corgi, and Gray, your resident shepherd.
And today we'll be talking about what would happen in our philosophy after high school. And Abby really liked the title, which is
Gen College.
I was going to say it too, because it's so good, but what is it?
It's a planned collagen.
Yeah, and that didn't make a lot of sense.
But it was fun. Whimsy,
Yeah, and Gen College is supposed to be a commentary that many people in our current generation are sort of pressured into going to places of higher learning, college, universities, that kind of thing. There is a poll, I think we read somewhere online, that they took a survey of Gen Alpha people who I think right now are like 13 to 17 years old. Again, don't quote me on that, but I think that's roughly what they are.
I think it might be Gen Z. I think Gen Alpha is currently the 10 to 12-ish and maybe younger. I could be wrong, but I think that's it.
Okay. Well, either way, some of the most sought after jobs when those young people were asked what they'd like to do with their lives were things like doctors, teachers, engineers, lawyering. That was very high on the list. There were other professions that didn't require university or college, but the vast majority of what we saw there did. And what that tells us is that there is still a stigma or a pressure that to have a good job, you need to go to higher education. So we are Gen College.
I thought it was a joke that there's a little bit of dystopia in social media nowadays, and all of the young people are feeling pressured to look like they're 20 years old and perfect all the time. And they're starting to use anti-wrinkle creams when they're 7 years old in some cases. So I thought it was a joke that everyone is trying to use collagen because it's starting to feel on social media a little bit that you don't have value unless you are at peak beauty.
That is what I meant the whole time. I meant to say that there was a lot of social pressure to go to higher education and
to be beautiful,
to look eternally youthful. You caught me, Abby, but I confess, I am indeed clever. Yeah. So moving on. Essentially, we talked about in the last episode a bit about how we would suggest that the high school age demographic of developed countries be standardized so that there was a heavier focus between the ages of 13 and 18 on practical life skills, including parenting, household, and sort of practical knowledge.
I was going to say general life skills.
Ooh, I like that. That's better. And if you're following along in the book, in the social blueprint, which would look like this.
And like these.
You would be at chapter 26 right now. And so you could follow along there. But in any event, the story in chapter 26 that talks about this particular phase of a person's life, that being sort of 18 years to 25 years old, is a boy looking for a pair of shoes.
I really like this fable. I think it's a lot of fun. So a father brings his son into a shoe store just about 5 minutes before closing. And he says, pick any pair of shoes you like, because the young boy, he was growing, he needed new shoes, his weren't fitting properly. And the boy said basically to his father in plain English, because we know Ian likes to use ye old English, and I don't know if I could do that justice. But essentially he said, it would be a waste of money for me just to buy a pair of shoes without having to try them on first. We should come back in the morning so we have time to look at the different makes and the different models. And not only that, but to try them on, walk around the store a little bit, see how they feel, compare and contrast, because shoes are an expensive commodity. They were back then and they still are. And it's a waste of money just to buy the first pair of shoes that you think might be good without actually testing their metal, as it were, to see if they're any good.
I like that. So that's the story. And just as we acknowledge that certainly it's important to try on shoes before you buy them, we notice that in Gen College, that a young person who's transitioning from childhood into adulthood will have an idea of what they want to do and spend many years and lots of dollars being educated in the university and college system for what they want to do. But then at the end of it, learn three things. First of all, that there may not be any openings for the job that they have rigorously worked for, because the university system doesn't seem, and especially in Canada, I don't know how around the world, but maybe in the country that you know about, but certainly in many developed countries, for sure, there is not a good ratio of people graduating to what society actually truly needs in terms of professions. Number two, they will find themselves in tremendous debt a lot of the time. And number three, that the job that they've worked so hard for to learn about and be educated about, A, they maybe don't like, but B, the skills you learn in the ivory tower of university almost never apply, in my observation, to the reality of the workplace. Now, Abby can speak for herself, but I will tell you that in my experience, and I've had several sort of careers over my life, when I think of the most important learning of the job, I usually learn more on the first day of the job than I did in the whole process of being educated for the job. And that's simply because of what we were talking about before, Abby, is that when you do something with your whole body and your whole mind and you're really involved in a task, you learn more in 1 second of doing that than 10 hours of just reading about the work. Did you find that in your life?
Absolutely. I mean, the first time I had to stand in front of a judge and just remand something, I was petrified. I couldn't remember if it was your honor or your worship. And I was shaking visibly, and the weight of what I had to do hit me as I was trying to do it, which is not ideal. And I remember my first day ever supply teaching was terrifying because all of a sudden you're by yourself and you have no supports and you're standing in front of people you don't know, and there's a lot of them, and you haven't had the opportunity to learn their needs or maybe some of their behaviors and the best methods to handle that. And also with supply teaching, generally students still sometimes use that as an excuse to be on not their best behavior because they feel like it's a day to get away with that. So I agree. And if I can speak to the first example, which is having a job that you work hard in university and then you don't have a job by the end of university. So teaching as an example, I'm intimately familiar with. When I was in, I want to say elementary school, there was a shortage of teachers and they were saying, please go to university, get a degree, be a teacher. Here's the problem with that. Teachers college is considered a master's program. So you have to have an undergraduate degree first. So that is minimum 3 years, usually an average of 4 years. I did a 4-year undergrad, but let's say you did 3 years. In Canada, up until sort of recently, it was a 2 to 3 year program at that time to become a teacher on top of that. So let's say minimum 5 years. In the 5 years for young people who they were targeting with this information, who were still in high school planning their lives, by the time they finished high school, graduated, gotten into university, done the 3-year undergrad, gotten into another university, done their 2-year master's program, all of a sudden there weren't jobs in teaching anymore because in 5 years, there's enough time for those spots to be filled. It was helpful for people maybe who were already teachers who'd taken a step back because previously they weren't able to find a job and they'd switch careers, or maybe adults with degrees who were able to do 1 or 2 years of education to pivot into education. So then all of a sudden we had an influx of teachers who weren't able to be employed as teachers. I have had different jobs as well. And my first career was more of a legal style of career. And by the time I went into teaching, it had pivoted back to so many people had spoken out about the fact that they got a degree in teaching and there were no teaching jobs. And I think the same thing happened with nursing, that all of a sudden no one went into the profession of teaching. So then all of a sudden they had a shortage again. So I happened to be able to fit into the shortage of teachers when it happened. And now with problems with education and behavioral issues, the teaching profession is in crisis. And I think anyone could get a job in it if they really wanted to at this point. But that aside, it is unfortunate that there's these ebbs and flows where they encourage everyone to do a job. No one can get a career, then no one does the job. And sort of, I think what we want is consistency.
Now, it's worth noting that some countries have streamlined the process of getting from high school to higher education in a specific stream. I'm pretty sure it's Germany where you go right from high school to medical school, for example. And so it varies from country to country. But the lesson we can take out of this is for university style programs, if you are honest with yourself, if you've been through those programs, or if you talk to people who have been through those programs, and again, they're being honest, I have found in finding this information, and you will find if you try as well, that the experiences that most shaped the professional to be were the co-op type things and the hands-on type classes rather than book learning. And yet, just like high school and elementary school, Western society sort of has a fixation on book learning that we feel is a damaged behavior that needs to be essentially mainly done away with. Obviously, there's going to be a place for book learning in educating our young people, but we feel it should take a back seat. Whereas right now, it's sort of in the pilot seat and it's really got control of the plane here. And I'm not sure where the plane's going, but we don't love it. So, what are we saying? What we're saying is we argue in the social blueprint that at this point in the acts, in the steps, and remembering that quite a, maybe even a few decades or certainly quite a few years have passed since the start of the first step, which was the baby license, the second step, which was the reformation of elementary schools and then high schools.
Wasn't the second step the Guardian Center and the third step elementary school?
I stand corrected, which is exactly right. And so it has sort of led up to this point so that the individuals traveling downstream of the first step are now in the right place. It's just like if you were standing on a river if you were on a treadmill. Sometimes I go running on a treadmill, Abby?
Indeed. It's very scary. I am not brave enough to get on a machine that will yeet you into a wall if you are not careful.
And Abby, you've seen me on this yeet machine. Do I start at the fastest setting?
No, he is skilled and wise in that he starts. I don't know if you're just turning the machine on or if it starts that way, but it's more of a fast walk for a couple seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes into sort of a quick jog. And then that quickly turns into a run. And then near the end of your endeavor on this yeet machine of doom and fear, I have nothing against treadmills. I just cannot operate them.
That's what it says on the handlebars.
He goes to what I would consider lightning speed. So he works his way up to the fastest speed.
What do you think would happen if I went from not moving to the fastest speed?
Well, I think you might injure yourself in that you'll be yeeted into the wall. But on a more practical note, I think that, when you do exercise, it is often encouraged to warm up. So not only things like light cardio, light movement to get your body moving, and then doing some light stretching, you're also supposed to slowly work your way up in the exercise. You're not supposed to start with full intensity because you could pull or tear a muscle, which, if I'm correct, Ian, has happened to you.
Sadly, yes. So I speak from experience when we say that it's important to take baby steps first. And so that is why, even though it can be hard to say, well, Ian and Abby, we don't really agree that it's just a good idea to dissolve universities and colleges. Don't we need those and everything like that? But
we haven't said that yet.
Oh, well, I kind of said it. I didn't say it like that. But now we say it like that. And what I'm getting at is every policy Abby and I propose, and then we argue for in the book, is like that treadmill and would only be possible if the step before it were followed in a safe way. And this is in contrast to what Abby and I see a lot of in the news and various people who are putting forward very pro-social policies, but often it's policies that would come at the wrong time and result in a strain to the society, just like a strain in the runner, if they're tried to implement a perfect society or a perfect policy right away. Always we come from the standpoint that in order to improve society, you have to improve the person first. And in order to improve the person first, you have to improve the child first. In order to improve the child first, you have to improve the parent first. In order to improve the parent first, you have to understand damage. And that's sort of how we structured the book. In any event, what we are talking about, Abby, is a little bit of a reformation of how a person's life would look in a standardized way after they finish the high school segment of the new education system we propose. And what about a year of military experience? That's something we wrote about. Why would that be a good thing to do?
Okay. Many things to say. The first is that we're not saying to eliminate college university experience altogether. We are sort of arguing that it should be modified because presumably you will still need the physical space to educate in some capacity because many jobs will still require a classroom style setting.
That's very true.
So we're not knocking anything down, but just be aware that our intention is to modify the intention of these institutions and what they stand for and what they are allowed to do. Fair?
That is well said.
So, one thing that struck me, Ian informed me of this. I was unaware. So, as we may have mentioned, Ian has experience with the military.
Mhm.
So, he is intimately familiar with the goings on. And he said it really dramatically changed his life having this experience. And there are so many countries that have a mandatory year of military service for all of the citizens once they hit 18 and graduate from high school. I had no idea. I was thinking maybe one or two. I Googled it. There were something like at least 20 countries. There were a bunch in Scandinavia, in Africa, in the Middle East. And I thought, how do we not know this? That there are so many countries who have this requirement. And I kind of love the thought because hear me out. In the military, a lot of people now are encouraging young people to join the military if they're able, because you wouldn't be necessarily deployed. You could be in the reserves for the limited amount of time. And Ian's proposal of a 1 year military service makes it much more palatable because if, let's say, it was a 5 year service, that's a lot of your life to commit to potentially not knowing exactly where your home base would be, not knowing what your job might be. But I really do love the idea of 1 year because, Ian, elaborate on this for me. Isn't it true that if you join the military, a lot of services are paid for on your behalf?
That's very true. In Canada, if you are a member of the armed forces, as a regular member, they'll often help pay for your education as it currently is.
Mhm. What else?
What else will they pay for?
Well,
I,
in our suggested proposed modification to
Mhm.
education, I alluded to this because I don't think it's audacious of me to make this point, but we are alluding to the fact that, like in many Scandinavian European countries, education should not be a burden, and the government should help with such an investment, as it were.
Mhm.
That's what I was trying to allude to. I apologize. But I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Well, I like it. So let me start. I will answer that, but let me start with this, Abby. I'll ask you a question. Answering a question with a question. Typical.
Typically, Ian.
Typical Ian. So let's say you've just had your students write a test and they all come forward and they put it in a pile on your desk.
Yes.
And let's say you want to bring those to your office to mark them.
Mhm.
How would you collect those papers?
I would pick them up.
And is there something that we would all probably do as soon as we pick up those papers that were sort of piled on top of each other in a
Mishmash.
in a mishmash?
I'd probably straighten them.
How would you do that?
I would smack them and you hit them on the desk. You know, the violence you conduct towards the paper products.
You tap them on the desk and you line them all up. And that way they're all uniform. And so let's bear in mind that we've spent a lot of time in the last few episodes with the new education system for licensed individuals. Remember, right at the beginning of Act 1, we talked about the baby license and that there would be some people who were very vulnerable, born unlicensed, who would go to the guardian centers from sort of 0 to 18. And then there were individuals born licensed who would sort of pass through the new education system we described. Now, the learning, we argue, in the new education system for licensed and unlicensed people would be very similar, almost identical. The only difference being, of course, those at the guardian centers would also have the benefit of a surrogate home in the guardian center, whereas those born licensed would already have, ideally a functional home to accompany their learning. So now these two streams are finally going to meet for the first time again. And not only that, we're going to have young people from all kinds of education backgrounds because let's face it, the education a lot of the time depends on the educators. So it's a very good idea, I think, on a practical level to take these young pieces of paper and sort of make sure that nobody has fallen through the cracks and one of the papers isn't ripped and kind of like has coffee on it. That student really wasn't doing the test very well because they were drinking coffee and attacking their test score.
Relatable.
So you just want to make sure the papers are just kind of good to go. And that's what I liked about the military, in my experience. And if you talk to people, don't take my word for it, talk to people in the military, or if you were in the military yourself, you will know that one of the tenets is discipline and esprit de corps. In other words, binding people in a unit together with the idea to work as a team to create better results than you can individually.
So essentially, you're saying that military instills the ability to have discipline and all of these core values that we're trying to instill and just sort of make sure that they're there.
Yes, it's a very helpful way to make sure any individual and young person who doesn't have good discipline to instill it. Now, you may be saying, Ian and Abby, why is discipline so important? Well, discipline by itself isn't actually all that helpful. It's what discipline represents that is very positive, because discipline, if it's in a positive way, let's say you have a fireplace in your house, and the rule of the house is you can't sit on the fireplace or you can't play around the fireplace. Let's say that was a rule from the parents to the children.
Good rule. If you touch the fireplace, you will be burned swiftly.
So if you were a parent in that household, you probably wouldn't want the kids playing around the fireplace.
No, what if they trip? What if they fall?
What if they trip and fall into the fireplace? And so if a child were to do that contrary to the rules of the household and had to go to their room for 15 minutes or whatever to discipline them, the young person maybe wouldn't love that at the time. But it's important that that's a good example of the parent showing love to the child, because it's discipline in the long-term best interest of the child. And in the same way, if discipline is done correctly so that it is to enforce good behavior that will be in the best interest of the person receiving the discipline, then it is a form of love as well. And so again, all the way through, we want to inject love into a system that is devoid of love to inflate that. So that's good. Military good for that reason. Second thing is, it's sort of a microcosm of all the different sort of roles in society. You will see engineers, medical people, tradespeople, all kinds of cooks.
And I think they also have trades like lawyers and doctors and people who make armor and clothing. There's pretty much every profession you could think of in the world. You need someone with that skill set in the military.
Yes, they stopped making armor about in the 1500s, but
I'm sure they have some kind of protective gear. I know there's, bulletproof vests, and then they wear those helmets sometimes. They look very sturdy.
I should have never come back from the Renaissance Fair wearing my full suit of plate armor and told her I'd been drilling.
At war.
Yes, I think I gave the wrong impression. But no, so it's a very good little way, a little trick that we think is important to improve society. But wait, I don't want to focus on that this episode, because Abby's right. We need to talk about the next phase after that. So we would see, rather than traditional postgraduate education, a year of military training followed by apprenticeship programs.
Yes. So I stand to be corrected. But it sounds like when you're in the military, the gut instinct, depending on your experience and exposure to the military, might be that you're drilling, you're training, you're preparing to fight in some capacity. Ian has come to inform me, because I had very little exposure to the military before I met him, was that you don't necessarily have to be doing much of that. Obviously, there will be some basic few weeks of initiation, or probably a word he knows better that explains the getting the papers in line. But what could these students, young people, be doing? So they're 17, 18 years old. They've just graduated from high school. What is the intention of the 1 year in the military? What is their function during that time?
Well, the function is to develop skills in a trade that will support the mission. So obviously in a military setting, what we call boot camp a lot of the time. Think of boot camp. Okay, now erase a lot of the horrible movies that you've probably seen about it. Boot camp, as we argue it should be, is a system of being divided into platoons and learning basic maneuvers as a team and the accomplishing of chores as a team. For example, in the military, you have to make sure every morning your bed is made to a certain standard. Now, it's way above the standard that a bed really needs to be made at. But the point was, it was routine building, and there was consequences if the routine wasn't followed. And over time and over months, this is a very helpful thing for a young person, just to make sure that they understand how important routine is, because then they can go off in their life and obviously they're going to flex their routine however they want. But that was part of it, is learning the routine. The second part is being able to work with the other members of your squad. If you are doing a mock exercise or you have to do a patrol or dig a trench and line the top with sandbags, or get barbed wire strung out across a certain area to cover a certain area or something like that. The point is you're doing things as a team to further your goals. And then the last thing was you're sort of learning about what you're good at in the unit. So what your likes are and what your niche is. I hope that answers the question.
I think you'd get exposure to a lot of different activities, which might help you learn what your talents are. Because one of the things that people always say is don't get a job based on your interests, get a job based on your talents, your skills, because that will make you truly happy because you can excel in that. And I also just realized, so I, as it stands, could not ever join the military because I'm anaphylactic. That is a prohibitive factor. But in this modified existence of the military, they'd obviously let everybody join in whatever capacity they could participate in. So presumably the rule is because if you were deployed in some capacity, you can't control your environment and it's very dangerous for yourself and your squad. If one person, if they have an environmental factor that they're just exposed to, start dying, and if you have a concern you're supposed to be focusing on, you need to be able to put all of your attention on the mission, presumably. That's my guess. In this modified existence of what that would look like, obviously there could be people who join the military as it stands and go for that purpose. But for the people who join because of this program, they would essentially be given the opportunity to sort of focus more on the skills and the talents and the ideals behind the military. And I realized that one of your examples was making beds very nicely. And one of my core jobs is to make a lot of beds on a daily basis for our guests. So I thought it was funny that even though I didn't join the military, I did learn the skill of making a very crisp bed.
There you go. She's practically military in her heart. So again, it could be a year, it could be however long, but we argue that there should be, maybe a year of military experience after high school. And yeah, most people would pass through that system and not stay in the military. That would be normal. Some people would. But talking about what would happen after that, well, again, based on our life experience and how we've observed society, it seems good that apprenticeship programs be the cornerstone of higher education. So no matter what trade, profession, line of work you may be interested in, it would be good for the government to, and not private institutions like universities and colleges, but the government to pay for, publicly fund, and organize a program where a young person is connected to a mentor in a certain program. And perhaps the mentor would have to be accredited in some way. Perhaps there would be an incentive for a mentor to become a mentor. But the idea being is after 4, 5, 6 months, depending on what the trade happens to be, the mentor could write a report card essentially, to basically say, look, this person's well suited for this job. They should move to the next step and pursue this job. Or the report card might be, this person's really not suited. I've been doing this for 20 years. This person's not cut out for this. And I'm sure it would reflect the same feelings as the young person had. If the young person didn't want to do a program, they might not do it. But the idea is you may go through 2, 3, 4, 5 apprenticeship programs. You can do that in 2 years. But you haven't lost any money because the government's going to fund that. And you're getting practical training.
And it counts as work experience. And if I may, just 2 things really quickly. So the first, I presume in the year of military training, while you might not be participating in the jobs, because all of these jobs exist, I presume you'd want to be exposed to many of them during your year. So it's not like you're going into an apprenticeship program blind. Maybe you have an interest in cooking, as an example. So maybe during your year, you make an effort to sort of shadow or maybe spend some time watching or experiencing in some capacity the chefs who feed the masses. And hands-on, as Ian mentioned, hands-on practical experience, when you actually see and do a job for the first time, it dramatically alters A, your perception of the job, B, whether or not you like it, and C, your perspective on how going forward this could actually look. Because in a sterile classroom setting, mostly books and paper, it really is hard to conceptualize how you will feel and how this will work in practice. So presumably you spent a year and you have been able to sort of get an idea of maybe some of the careers you're interested in. And then in the apprenticeship program, they would have as many spots available at a time as jobs are available.
Mhm.
So one of the key incentives for this program is to make sure that everyone who participates in a program, in a profession, can be gainfully employed in the real world with that profession. No one is going through years of education, whether or not it's free, and just wasting their time. These are all viable spots. And presumably, if someone is not suited, if there's a waiting list of people who would also like to be part of that job, they can switch over. There's obviously option for that, but I think it's a positive thing.
You know, when an artist paints a canvas, an old school artist, and they have their little
Palette?
palette of colors, they see what colors they need on the canvas, and then they take their little bottles of paint. I assume it comes in bottles like ketchup. And they sort of squeeze out what they think. Oh, I'm painting a sky, this painting, so I'll need lots of blue. And I'm colorblind, by the way, so this is quite an exercise for me. And oh, there's lots of grass in this picture, so I need quite a bit of green. And oh, there's several squirrels. I'll need some red because they're red squirrels, but not too much red.
A little bit of brown.
A little bit of brown, you see? But the point is, the artist does that because if they put a lot of black on their palette that they're never going to use on the canvas, that black paint will dry out and be wasted.
And paint's expensive.
Paint's expensive. That's just what we're saying. Paint is expensive because the paint is like the training of people in certain professions. And you always hear stories about people getting out of higher education and not being able to find a job right away. And so, in the same way, the apprenticeship program controlled by the government could make sure that apprenticeship liaisons with mentors would be tailored, as Abby said, to the need of society at the time. As a concrete example, in Canada right now, there's a shortage of personal social workers because there's such an influx of baby boomers, as they're called, becoming
Senior,
very old. They need help. And there's not enough PSWs to do it. So an apprenticeship program could have made sure there was lots of
opportunity,
orange, the orange of personal social work on the palette. But where is the orange? It is not there.
And the thing is, if you're looking at your skills and your talents, you will find that there's more than one career that you can excel in. I know in high school currently, people tend to think of sort of the top 10 most common jobs. When they think of medicine, they think of doctor and nurse. They don't think of phlebotomist. They don't think of neurosurgeon. They don't think of different technicians. They don't think about all the different people who are in the medical system and are different specialties within that system. You sort of go to medical school and then you realize what different options you have. But it's important to be able to be exposed to different types of careers because in the justice system, people think lawyer, but there are clerks, there are personal service or social workers who work there. There are people who work in what is called victim services to support those who are coming to testify, maybe, and they're not in the best state. There are different resources so that the accused, when they're coming out of the justice system, can have access to, remedial programs to get more skills, to find work, to find housing, to re-access their finances. There's a lot of different people involved in every system. So as it stands right now, people don't think of the lateral and sometimes more common jobs. They just think of, in every sector of society, sort of one or two positions that are very common on TV. And they don't acknowledge the other opportunities that they might be super viable for. So this is all to say that if someone has a skill or a talent and maybe they love a field, as like to use the example I've already been using, law or medicine, there are so many opportunities in both of those sectors for work that maybe aren't lawyers specifically. Maybe there's enough of those when they're coming through the education system, but they could still have meaningful, wonderful careers full of work that interests them and uses their skills and talents.
Yeah, bingo. And so, in a nutshell, to summarize, we argue that basically any profession under the sun could be taught through apprenticeship style, sort of 6 months rotations with a mentor better than the lengthy programs that university and colleges offer that are sort of academia based. Even doctor, even veterinarian, even surgeon, even dentist, even lawyer, what people associate with book learning. Don't you think, Abby?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think in the book, I stand to be corrected from our own book, but I think 6 months was the totality you needed to become proficient in the profession, if I'm correct. It could be years, but for many professions, you wouldn't need to spend 3 years in school learning that profession. You could learn it in sometimes only a handful of months. So when we say 6 months, if something isn't working, you wouldn't stay in an apprenticeship for the whole 6 months. Maybe you stay there for one day if it's really not working out, or it's only a month or two. You still gain skills and work experience you could put on your resume. But I think the idea is 6 months to a year, maybe longer if it's an intense medical profession, which would require that training. You'd be able to have the skills to have an actual job without needing to go through all of these courses and years of education that might not be relevant to your goals.
Yes, it would certainly have to be flexible depending on types of jobs. We're giving sort of a sketch of a drawing here. We leave it to society and the future to kind of color in all the details. So that's the first tenet of our argument, is that it is better almost universally for apprenticeship programs to exist rather than the traditional higher learning ivory tower style. Now, two other things perhaps we didn't mention, but first of all, we have already in society many programs that already are apprenticeship based. These are a lot of trades. I know, for example, that electricians and plumbers and carpenters in Canada will go through an apprenticeship program. And the way I see that result is excellent. When I see a carpenter come work on a project that Abby and I are working on at the resort, for example, and the apprentice is following along, well, it's clear that the apprentice is doing the exact kind of work they would be doing as a master carpenter. And so it's just excellent. And that apprentice is also getting paid a salary at the same time and not incurring that great debt that currently a lot of professions who pass through the university system as it is incur. So I just wanted to remind people that we would encourage basically a whole universe of apprentices and just spinning around the sun. But no, a universally applied government sort of assisted apprenticeship program for everyone moving through from ages 18 to 25, let's say roughly, in developed countries, a place that wouldn't cost the individual moving through them funds, but where they could earn money by assisting a mentor and learning from the mentor and becoming the best assets to society they could.
To be honest, that sounds really nice because as it stands, and my personal experience with the educational system, I have about 8 or 9 years of education behind me, too many. And that experience was incurring tremendous amounts of debt, and the cost per year of education was equivalent to a full salary before taxes are deducted for most working professionals who have been in that profession for several years. So obviously not an amount of money that somebody could produce if they're not working full time as a skilled worker. And then on top of that, you're so tired because you are working so hard trying to do well in your educational journey that you're spending all of these hours studying and looking at resources. And as it stands, in my experience, it's pretty intense. They give you a lot of work every week, more than maybe a full-time job would ask. And then you also, on top of that, have to have 1, 2, 3 part-time jobs. I, at one point, had 3 part-time jobs at the same time in an attempt to make just enough money to cover rent and food, let alone any of my university tuition. So the thought of being able to not only have your education paid for, but to make money doing your education, it really allows for sort of a mental, physical, emotional well-being. Because right now, these young adults, these young people, are being put in the worst possible start to their adult lives because they're incurring stress, extreme debt, and they're not able to take time for themselves to be able to recalibrate, because all of their spare time, when they're not studying and paying a lot of money to study, is to make very little money and working very hard part-time jobs, which are very stressful. So it sounds like there would be a work-life balance involved in this. So I really like that.
Me too. And that's why we wrote about it together. And that's why we want you to read about it. And if you have any comments, if you think this would work well, wouldn't work well, what changes you would propose along those veins, we'd love to read about it in the comments section or hear about it. But I think that pretty well sums it up. I think that was chapter 26, I believe it was. Is that the boy in the shoe?
Yeah.
Is that how we started this?
Yeah.
It seems so long ago. But thank you for sticking with us.
Good conversation.
A year of military service and an apprenticeship program that was sort of regulated to get people trained in an excellent way.
Find the job you want, be able to switch as many times as you need without having to lose all of your tuition or being kicked out of your school, and be paid for it.
And funneled towards a profession that society has a need for. I like how we almost gripped each other's ideas there. That could have been bad. We could have just knocked each other out mentally. So, coming at you from Dancing with Damage, thanks for tuning in, and we'll hope to see you next episode.
Have a great day.